Today is the 10th of October, 2024. My name is Bea Lewkowicz. I'm the director of the AGR Refugee Voices Archive and the lead on the Holocaust Testimony UK portal. I'm very pleased that today we're going to talk to James Bulgin from the Imperial War Museum about the collection of the Imperial War Museum and maybe the use of interviews in the galleries. James, maybe can you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yes, my name is James Bulgin. I am the head of public history at Imperial War Museum, but I was the head of content for the Holocaust galleries. So I led on the creation of those galleries.
Okay, that's great. So, James, first we'll talk a little bit about the collection itself and the collection featured on our portal, and then secondly about the usage of interviews in the galleries.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the collection of, Holocaust survivors, refugees, and maybe how that sits with the broader collection of interviews at the Imperial War Museum.
Yeah, so I suppose the collection of Holocaust testimonies at the museum falls into two sort of categories. There's the vast majority of the oral testimony interviews that were conducted over a period of time with individuals who were kind of touched by this history in various different ways. That's obviously refugees and or people who had were incarcerated in different concentration camps or different ghettos, a range of different experiences. And those interviews tend to be of a reasonable length, and they tend to cover off the whole kind of life narrative from one end to the other. So obviously they were recorded over a period of time, so that only takes us as far as that person was in their life at the time that the interview was done, and sometimes that is now relatively historic by our kind of contemporary standards, but it's interesting how much focus there is on the specificity of personal experience, particularly in the pre-war period and sort of formative years. So the experiences of what occurred during the Second World War and indeed just before the Second World War and the years before the Second World War are part of, are contextualized within, whole kind of life narratives. So that's the oral testimony.
And sorry to interrupt you, James, was that a conscious decision? So who are the
Yeah,
people? Who were the people? I don't know whether you know who were the people who were doing the first interviews.
I believe so. I don't have the names off the top of my head. The majority were done by a single person, but it was sometimes people within the organization, and sometimes it was people contracted in or specialists doing those interviews as well. There's one individual whose name completely escapes me, which is terrible, but who did a significant number of them. But it's very consistent with IWM's overall approach. IWM is a museum of social history, so we're interested in how conflict affects people in a variety of different ways. We're not a museum of military history. We're not, solely interested in the specificities of kind of conflicts and the military dimensions of that. And I think actually I would say as an approach, like I say, it is IWM have been collecting oral testimony for a long time. Relatively long time. But I would say as an approach, it's weathered well. I think
the life history, general life history.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that I find myself thinking when you use it for various different reasons, thinking, oh God, I'm so pleased that you asked that. Like I'm so pleased that you included those elements of it within the narrative, because I can see that at other times and at other points and in other contexts that the entire focus would be on a very specific part of the history. And for us, because as a museum, we are a museum of social history and we're interested in people, being able to have a degree of insight into the detail of people is so critical. And we certainly found ourselves a lot thinking, like what happened before this, or why did you do that and not that, or what was the sort of the range of circumstances that informed that course of events. And often that information is contained within the recordings, which is really useful.
James, sorry can I ask you, what is the average length? Because I've noticed that some of them are really, really long. And for example, a person comes up on the portal as Hella Pick, who we interviewed, Refugee Voices interviewed, quite a long interview. But I think if I'm not mistaken. They're like 30 hours of hella pick. I mean, it's a really, really long interview. So what,
That
whether there's any guidance or it is completely up to the interviewer.
it was broadly, to the best of my understanding, it was broadly determined by, how the thing was working in the moment. I think, that there's obviously um a structure, and there's a sort of a loose anticipation of how things would last, but there is a relatively broad range,
Mm.
actually. Some of them last a few hours, some of them last a lot of hours. And
Mm.
obviously the other thing with IWM's collection, which again is, product of the technology available at the time, is they tend to sort of then split into separate reels,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
the physical media that was being used at the time to record these things means that they couldn't just go on indefinitely. And it's interesting to hear, actually, because you do sometimes find that it just cuts out in the middle, and then the voice will come on saying, sorry, the recording cut out there, can we pick it up from this point? But the other thing which is really helpful is that at the point at which they were kind of processed, the cataloging of it was pretty comprehensive.
hmm,
So the survey that's offered in the catalog record is useful in terms of sort of steering you towards what you're looking for. But yeah, I mean, there is a wide range of lengths, that's for sure.
yeah.
In
I mean,
terms
you're
of,
right. So you have to kind of listen to it in half-hour chunks, I think.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, which is, I mean, it's an interesting question for everyone, what happens in the time between changing tapes,
I, I,
and what gets lost in that time. And sometimes, does the interviewer remember the end and picks up at the right place? Because often sometimes you don't, and you just kind of yeah.
no, but I think it's such an
Yeah.
important point about history, full stop. That history happens in a time and a place and a context which is physical and practical. And I think
Yeah.
so much of history sort of, for whatever reason, abstracts it from those really sort of almost like mundane realities, and it does make you very aware of what the sort of the physical parameters
Mm.
of the practicalities allow for or don't allow for.
And
Like we,
maybe
sorry,
even more because you don't see anything else. It's, because it's audio. That's one of the kind of reminders of that limitation or space that they
I,
had to change tapes.
I suppose it definitely focuses your attention on that in a certain way. I
Yeah.
mean, it's always been really interesting to me that the kind of the form, or the sort of assumption about form in the way that these things have been used historically, means that they're sort of filleted, so that quite often they're kind of divorced from that, originating reality. So you just hear, like, sound bites almost, or little
Yeah.
excerpts, and you don't hear the bit where the interviewer's going, you're right. Do you need a drink? Do you need to a
Yeah.
little rest? All these sort of, obviously you'll know this better than anyone. Because obviously it's the reality of the human interaction. I suppose there is, there's pros and cons to filmed video testimony versus oral testimony, but the oral testimony definitely does sort of bring a degree of kind of intimacy, I suppose, in some way, to the detail of what's occurring. You do very much get a sense that there's potentially just two people in the room
Yeah.
doing this thing, and they're just having a conversation.
And James, can I ask you, so is it all, first of all, are you still interviewing, or was it all cassettes, or at some point was it switched to anything else? The
I
medium?
I'm not that I'm not sure about. I'm assuming, because of when it was happening, and I don't. It's been a while since there's been a new oral testimony interview of a Holocaust survivor. So it would be, I assume that was the media that was being used at the
Yeah.
time. And
Yeah.
in terms of what's going on now, it's not part of our current um work. It's not to say that it wouldn't become part of our current work again. I mean, obviously we talk about it, but for the galleries, we recorded second and third and fourth gen interviews. So that was a kind of a discrete piece of work. But at the moment, the focus of oral testimony is elsewhere. It's been interesting though, because oral testimony has have definitely had something of a resurgence culturally in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. That, it's been used significantly more in exhibitions, both at IWM and elsewhere,
Yeah.
and in documentaries and stuff. I think, just anecdotally, the teams who manage these things and license these things have said this, but there's been a noticeable uptick in people interested in using oral testimony.
Do you think it's to do with the rise of podcasts? It's somehow that we're more used to listening. I mean, in a way,
That's a
I don't know.
really interesting idea. I mean, yeah, potentially it has got something to do with that, and I also think that
Yeah.
there's there's been a sort of quite innovative use of it as well. Like, so obviously for us at the museum, there was the Peter Jackson film, you know, the First World War Peter Jackson film, which not, They Should Not Grow Old, which used the oral testimony interviews in a really dynamic way.
Yeah.
And then we were involved in something quite recently about D-Day called D-Day: The Unheard Tapes. And that used the oral testimony interviews, but got actors to sort of lip sync to them. And at the time, I thought it was such an interesting approach because I mean, I would suggest that 15 years ago, 10 years ago, they would have, you know, taken the transcripts and got the actors to sort of, if they were going to do it at all, they would have got the actors to voice,
Yeah.
to
And that,
revoice. But they didn't.
so how did they do it?
It was really clever. They got they chose the sections of Old Testament they were going to use. They cast very well. They got a very, you know, skillful and talented cast of actors, and those actors familiarized themselves with the recordings really well. And then basically the oral testament itself was played, and the actors just mouthed the lines along with the
Oh, I
oral recording.
see. Like almost like a pantomime. And I mean, and
Yeah,
then
no, no, but it was a company called
interesting.
Wall to Wall who'd done something similar
Hmm.
using oral testimony relating to the AIDS pandemic, and
Uh-huh.
you know that had worked well, and it was one of those things that when it was first mentioned, I sort of thought, God, I don't. I
Mm.
mean, okay, you know, I'm sort of intrigued, and anything that is looking to sort of, particularly to use the, you know, the authentic
Mm.
archive, was always of interest. But when I saw it, I thought, oh my God, this is so this works so well, but in a way that at a distance you might not think it would. It was a really sort of creative and visionary way to use it. But what it means, and I'm a really passionate advocate of this. What it means is that you maintain the tiny nuance of the original delivery. Like the finest actor in the world is not capable of distilling the reality of the real. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's something in that, in this sort of the microscopic details of the original delivery that is irreplicable.
Yeah.
And that's what they managed to do. What I would also say about the way that they used it there is that it's because you know, and on some level you're consciously aware that it's not the actor who's speaking.
Yeah.
So the conceit never collapses the reality. It never
Yeah.
creates a sort of you know, a kind of a fake reality. There's always this sort of weird like Brechtian thing that's
Yeah, it's a
stopping
breakthrough.
you.
That's what I was thinking about just now, actually,
Yeah, no, no,
because it takes you away from it's clear that it's not the actor. So it's
yes.
a reality check almost. Yeah.
So it maintains that. Obviously, the
Yeah.
galleries were trying to do this quite a lot as well. It maintains that sort of lacuna, but I
Mm.
just think that it's almost like you know, pushing two the same sides of two magnets together. That those opposing forces create this
Yeah.
really sort of fertile energy
Yeah.
that is helpful because it doesn't seal it off. It doesn't say this is
Yeah.
it. This is the real person. This is the authoritative, you know, crystalline mimetic version of the historic past. This is a as an, you know, an insoluble but perpetually alluring moment of confrontation.
Because it's interesting that you say that because I do always quite feel slightly uncomfortable if a testimony is read by somebody else. I want to
I,
hear, I think the voice is so important, and taking the voice away, that to me creates something strange.
I completely agree. And funny enough, it was, and I'm not, you know, I'm not throwing shade on anybody who does this. It's obviously their prerogative, and people will have different
Yeah.
opinions. But funny enough, one of the things that was mooted for the galleries at one stage was saying, "Oh, we could get, you know, actors to reread some of the
Yeah.
lines," and I was like, "I no, no." And look, this is from somebody who spent, you know, the majority of their professional life before doing this working in theatre and working with phenomenal actors and you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I get it. You know, I think, you know,
Uh,
performance is a, you know, critical part of our being, and I'm
yeah,
you know, passionate about it. But I just think that, as you say, it's never the same, and I was there's something about the sort of the register of delivery which is so routinely used when
yeah,
written testimony is spoken that it turns it into something else,
yeah.
but with this sort of
Mm,
the suggestion that it is real. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. But I think in terms of the portrait will be interesting because at the moment we mostly have video testimonies
Hmm.
because, Shaw Foundation and Fortune. And it will be interesting to see whether, what people are looking for,
Hmm.
and uh, whether what is more accessible. But what I was going to ask you also, I found when I did my little research that the oldest interview I found from Imperial War Museum was 1980. Is that, you
Yeah,
think, about right? When was the first interview?
that sounds about right to me. Yeah, yeah. Which is interesting in and of itself, isn't it? Because it's I mean, I suppose that's around about the time of the TV series. You know, if we're talking about these sort of these moments
Yeah.
in Holocaust as sort of cultural memory, and that
Yeah.
is around about the time of that. But it's still some way short of the major moment in the early 1990s in the post-Schindler's List phenomena. You know, so it's
Yeah. So this would have been after that Holocaust series was aired in
yeah, but hot on the
70 and
heels of it, 'cause
70.
that was what 79, wasn't
Yeah, it
it?
was 79. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting to me
But you
that
know what I found, James? So the first one
um,
I found here is somebody called Margarita Burkill.
right.
And she was actually somebody who helped she was not a refugee herself. She helped in one of the committees.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And this was
Familiar
a
with that one.
1980 interview,
Okay. Okay.
which is interesting.
Yeah, no.
But I wonder how many, I mean, anyway, that's for the future researchers to find out
The
the dates of
trajectory.
interviews. But I definitely think that the Imperial War Museum are the earliest one, plus the Fortune of, I think they started also roughly the same time.
Okay. Yeah. Which is
Um,
before the sort of the explosion of
it is,
testimony, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah. And that will be interesting to see how different those testimonies are.
Yeah.
And I listened to a few of the Imperial War Museum. I find it interesting sometimes the tone of the interviewer. I don't know whether you have, I find sometimes it sounds quite stern, but
Right.
then looking back,
Yeah.
um, and I think that's interesting, the change of the tone of interviewers,
But yeah, no, totally. But then I suppose that I mean, obviously there's various different cultural factors to that. I mean, I find it
Yeah.
weird now if you watch you know, even just sort of newsreels or news footage from the
Yeah.
70s into 80s, like even during the 1980s, like most people wore shirts and ties as leisure wear. Do,
Yeah.
do you know what I mean? Like that sort of there's a degree of sort of you know
Yeah.
formality to the way that things worked, which is a thing. But I also think the thing which is really difficult to or important to remember, but easy to lose sight of, is that in 1980, let's say that's like, when I was at school, some of my teachers had sort of been, you know, alive just kids during the Second World War. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
and they had like they would talk to us about Second World War memories. I mean, yeah, like they were the older teachers, but nevertheless, like the the people that we're talking about at this stage aren't the people we're talking about by the late 90s into the noughties, you know, who were of an age and you
Yeah.
know they would have been appeared to be very different. You know, if we say Survivor now or you
Yeah.
know we it conjures in our head a certain
An old person.
image, yeah, basically, yeah,
And
and
they were not old in the 1980s. No.
no, and so you can see, but I suppose what the oral testimony doesn't do is accommodate that. So we sort of rely on, you know, the voice and stuff. Actually, that's one thing I will say. That's one of the things actually the techniques used on the D-Day thing um, was helpful for, because they cast actors to voice the roles who would have been about the same age as or they're clearly referencing the age of the person when they
Right.
were being interviewed,
Right.
not when they were at the time. So you sort of think they're between, you know, where I was thinking that with watching Shoah now, that it almost exists on these three temporal planes. There's the history, there's the point of articulation in the
Yeah.
testimony, and then
Yeah.
there's our contemporary engagement, point of engagement. And those things, those three moments are disparate enough that we have
Yeah.
to string together.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Three
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah. Yeah.
sites of memory.
It is. It is. And I think for the interview, that's why at the moment, actually, I have to change it. The date of the interview is so crucial, to understanding the interview, but the cultural situation, and an interview from 1980 is going to be very different than an interview from 2010.
And also like what exactly, and there and some of the things that spin off from that, like I saw something, a documentary a few years ago, more than a few years ago, maybe 5 6 years ago now, that it was ostensibly about kind of survivors and the Holocaust and stuff, but then sort of gravitated somehow towards Schindler and the Schindler Juden, and I just thought, but that's that much of a history. which is so much bigger, but because Schindler's sort of become this cultural thing, it's almost like it's got this gravitational pull. But
Yeah.
had that documentary been made in the early, 89 or whatever, there would have never been that
No,
sense that it has to pull in
no.
that direction.
Well, it's a change of, isn't it, cultural memory and then cultural memory influencing the. I mean, I've just this summer been at the Schindler's Factory. I've never
Right,
seen anything like it. You couldn't get in there.
right,
You couldn't
right.
get in there. I mean, there were queues and queues of tourists, going into the Schindler's Factory. It's amazing because of one film.
Because of one film, yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
it's actually extraordinary that how cultural memory is shaped.
It is.
James, what I was going to ask you in terms of methodology, because you obviously are somebody who's listened to the Imperial War Museum interviews, did you find a lot has changed? You said their life history interviews, but can you see a change from the 80s till
To a certain extent, I mean, I think this is obviously a perennial issue with testimony full stop, and obviously, you'd know this better than anyone, but sometimes I find myself thinking, just let them talk. Sometimes or it feels as if something's going in a certain direction. You think, ask them about that, and then it doesn't happen, but quite often it's more that. I don't know. I feel like perhaps or potentially, and obviously this relies on individuals and their kind of proclivities more than anything else. But I think we've become more aware of the value of space in
Mm.
interviews potentially than we were. And I think, it- I mean, certainly I would say anecdotally from our perspective, when we were recording the stuff we did do for the galleries, there was very much a a predetermined decision that we should allow there to be space, and if there was a moment that it felt like the silence could live, then to let the silence live. Because I think as humans we do this full stop. It's one of the things I talk to people about sometimes in terms of having difficult conversations, that we get so sort of nervous about uncomfortable silences that we sort of we're
Yeah.
determined to fill them. And actually it's not always the best approach. And I do find sometimes in the interviews you think you kind of crept in on them when they weren't finished,
Yeah,
and I think
yeah,
maybe there's more space for that. Funny enough, one of the things we talk about, and there's certainly for the like I say, for the ones we did do for the galleries, one of the moments which all of us were most struck by was at the very end of an interview, where two of the people that we were interviewing just sort of sat, and it was almost like they were just processing, and it was really meaningful, you know?
yeah. This is so interesting, James, because when I started maybe in the last 70 interviews, I started a sort of technique which kind of just happened that I end an interview with silence.
Hmm.
And it's a kind of weird thing because sometimes the interview thinks like, what's going on? And I'm just saying like this. And I have to say for myself, and I think for the person and for the cameraman and for everyone, it just demarks something and it's kind of necessary. And I've just made, I don't know whether you've seen it. I sent it to you. I made this little film, 2 minute silence.
Okay, of those.
It's a kinder transport and it's just people sitting there. And I'll send it to you. I mean, it is very powerful. And I think that is a very interesting, yeah, question whether the silence and gaps what we talked about, that's now more recognized and you make an effort not to jump in with the next question, and maybe that's part of the idea that it's not only about history, it's also about memory and giving space, and maybe those ideas have influenced obviously the interviewing.
I mean, I think that there's certainly, I mean, it probably goes in a slightly broader way. And one of the things I talk about at the galleries quite a lot is that, we were very mindful from the outset that the whole underlying kind of ambition of the project wasn't to sort of transact information. And it feels like potentially or perhaps testimony interviews were about this sort of transaction of, content. You've got things in your head that I want to get onto this recording, so I'm going to try and draw them out of your head, get them on the recording, and we'll call it a day. Rather than going, it's not necessarily about what you say, it's about how you say it and why you say it and the way that you say it, you know?
Yeah, yeah. But what I was going to ask, so for the opening of the first galleries, you did video recordings, which are
Hmm.
part of the portal. But for the second gallery, you decided not to use testimony. So maybe just tell us a little bit about the thinking behind it.
Yeah, so as you say, that in the first exhibition, the those video testimonies became I was describing them as kind of the narrative backbone of the interpretation, and they, and in fairness, not in fairness, that they were a kind of a pragmatic response to what was understood to be a problem, which was that IWM was basically embarking on the whole thing from kind of a standing start, and it had no collection to speak of specific to the history. And the team thought, well, if we don't get enough stuff, what are we going to build this exhibition around? And they, they had this idea of thinking, well, if we collect a kind of an archive of, or a contained archive of testimonies, then that can be the thing which gives structure, and then we can kind of build out from there. Um, which makes perfect sense, and obviously that's what they did, and they did it to great acclaim. When we came to work on the new galleries, it was a really very much an open question as to whether we would use, or
Mm.
whether at all we would use that testimony, or how we would use it. Um, the thing which steered our hand predominantly actually was that, and it's funny how these things work. It was substantially because when the First World War galleries were created, they'd adopted this principle that they call contemporaneity, which meant that
Yeah,
they only used things that were, part of the contemporaneous moment in question.
yeah,
And their problem, which wasn't so dissimilar to ours, was that the First World War has been so kind of reconceptualized in cultural memory, that it loses any of its kind of, you know contemporaneous uncertainty. There's a sense that somehow the war was about trenches and about poetry and about dirt and mud, and everything kind of
yeah.
necessarily tended towards that. And
Mm.
they were kind of going, well, actually, even things like trenches were kind of just a pragmatic response to what was occurring at the time. That
Yeah,
this introduction of heavy weapons into the fray, which had never really been sort of, encountered in on such a scale before, meant that they did the most obvious thing to do, which is to dig into the ground to sort of shield themselves. And that evolved into this whole kind of almost like military strategy. And so,
mhm,
but also the war was about far more than that. That was a
yeah,
dimension of the war, and it's part of it. And that the decisions that were made at the time might seem completely nonsensical to us now, particularly when they're sort of filtered through things like Blackadder Goes Forth, or the poetry and various other things. At the time, there is a sort of ostensibly a logic to them, or some degree of logic to them. So they thought, well, let's only use information that was available at the time. Let's
yeah,
only use letters from the time, diaries from the time, objects from the time, and it made sense, and it really helped to sort of pull apart the sort of the rigorously structured version of the conflict, and to suggest its sort of vicissitudinous nature and stuff. So we thought, when we started on the project, there was no mandate from the museum to adopt contemporaneity. Like, it's not a new sort of three-line whip thing that everyone has to do.
okay, yeah,
And we looked at it and we thought, well, actually, there is a lot of logic to adopting the same
mm,
principles for us, because actually the Holocaust is completely beset with a kind of, I was talking about, Lawrence Langer calls it the rhetoricization of the Holocaust, or called it, and Tim Cole uses this phrase, the mythologization of the Holocaust. This
yeah,
idea that cultural representations have completely sort of created a defined structure for the Holocaust and cultural memory, which is not only reductive, it's also often completely ahistoric. This sort of
yeah, yeah.
this obsession with, concentration camps and concentration camp uniforms and all that sort of stuff, which doesn't
Or
bear
the
any
Schindler, or
relation.
Schindler, for example. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And a lot of those things just don't bear any relation to the vast
Mm,
majority of people's, experiences. So,
yeah,
there was a kind of a value in that. The other thing for us, which was significant in terms of the use of testimony, is that, oh, look, and we'd already made the decision by the time this happened, but I was in this. I don't know. There could be like a virtually infinite number of examples of this, but for whatever reason, this is the one that sticks with me.
yeah,
When we were in Mauthausen, on one of our kind of many visits, I read this piece of text that said, there were a relatively small number of Dutch Jewish prisoners sent to Mauthausen in, I think 1942, 1941 maybe, but they said, but there's no accounts of their experiences because they were all killed. And the same could be said for so many different corners of this history. And I thought there is an inherent tension here in using or allowing the sort of the dominance of this within this vector of interpretation, because by its very nature, it can only articulate
yeah.
things that anybody survives to articulate. And in a
Yeah.
history that has so many, that involves such catastrophic loss, if we're not careful in the way that and this isn't me sort of denigrating testimony, obviously, in
No, no,
any,
no, no. I get it. I get
just
it.
within the
Yeah.
structure of the galleries, that I just thought there are so many parts here that there is nobody. But moreover,
Mm.
it also creates this slight problem in that, for example, right, Beljets, uh, two survivors of Beljets, only one of whom, lives beyond the end of the war. So if you were to use that one survivor, you somehow suggest or run the risk of suggesting that Beljits was survivable
Yeah.
for Jewish people.
I just, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Whereas
But
clearly,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, you know, it's a conundrum, isn't it? By using survivors' testimonies, of course, you talk to people who survived, so you represent the survivors and not the other people. And I have to say, for me, one of the most powerful thing in your exhibition is that pin at the end. I have to say,
Mhm.
whoever idea that was, I think it's absolutely brilliant. That pin which was deposited in
Mara Kellerman's pin, yeah.
in a bank and was never reclaimed. I thought that is just amazing. I mean, so powerful.
I think, I mean, that was very much. I just found a lot of places that I went to, certainly a lot of Holocaust museums, but also a lot of, I mean, a lot of Holocaust representation. It happens in Schindler's List, doesn't it? The there's this sort of sense that it has to finish on an upbeat,
Yeah.
and on a human level, I understand that, but when I look at this subject or stare at this subject and engage with it, I can only see it as a catastrophe for humanity. Do you know what I mean? And the idea that somehow the uptick at the end sort of displaces on any level the scale of the catastrophic loss, I think I just find deeply troubling. So that was very much the thing with the galleries, to say the galleries need to finish by acknowledging the fact that we
Mm.
will never know the extent of the absence that was
And
created.
do you find, James, I mean, this has been actually said once about interviews. I think first show interviews, and somebody asked me as well, the idea that you end up on the families, on the children, is that a sort of redemptive end? And why do people do that? And I've become aware of it. And, when I make a film, uh, I did actually say they have so many children. And then is that a redemptive end? Is that we are opposing it? Or is it what the interviewee actually wants? And often they want to talk about their family, so that's,
And also, funny enough, this really sort of struck me when we'd been to Yad Vashem, and I got back and we were there. Mr. Shalev, who was in charge of Yad Vashem at the time, I had a conversation with him, and his office gifted me this book called Dear Henry, and it was letters from a kinder transport boy to his family and his or from his family, between him and his family, and his
mm,
family had all been killed. And there was something about Yad Vashem. I don't know why, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was just a moment in time, I don't know, but all of us found being there very affecting.
yeah,
And we got back, and I was sitting on the sofa the day after we got back, and I picked up this book and opened it up, and got to the back, and at the back there was a picture of him, the boy, but it was an old man surrounded by all of his family, and it was just like it just got me, and I had that sort of response that it just caught me out completely, and
mm,
and I did think, do you know what? To your point, there is potentially a kind of an issue with that on some level, for sure. But at the same time, we also need to be really, really careful, I think, to be really, really clear about the fact that Hitler did not succeed. If the ambition of Hitler and those around him was to eradicate Jewish identity, Jewish presence in Europe, he didn't. He didn't do it, because
no,
they're here and he
yeah,
isn't. Do you know what I mean? And so there's something in that as well. But trying to balance those two things off
yeah,
is the challenge. And I think particularly with testimony, it's just trying to find that context and that balance, isn't it? It's trying to say, because ultimately, also, I think Ruth Kluger writes about it brilliantly, and Primo Levi does too. That they have this thing where they say we are not normative. Like, we are not
yeah, yeah.
we are not typical.
Yeah, but you also in the end of this exhibition, you put the old testimonies recorded for the other one uncut. So maybe just tell us a little bit about the thinking behind it. And I found it powerful. And again, not edited, not cut, and on a one big loop.
Yeah, that was funny enough. That was an idea that came in, because ostensibly we thought, well, then because of contemporaneity, we won't use the testimony. Then we thought, well, then the testimony has an important role to play. Of course, it does demonstrably, because the portal and all the testimony archives and the role that it has to play. So we thought, well, then how do you use it in a way that potentially slightly kind of recontextualizes it? So then because the last space is about legacies and about the sort of interface between the historic moment and the absolute present. What we wanted to do with testimony is to position it in the into the sort of the broad spectrum of the history. So, well,
Yeah.
because that last room is about this interface between the present moment and now, it was always about, yeah, like how the sort of present negotiates its relationship with this history.
Mm.
And the largest element in the space is a big screen which is leant against the wall, which has information about every single named individual in the galleries. Because of the principle of contemporaneity, it means that the galleries never look forwards. So they'll only ever talk about what's happening to the person at the moment in time in question, which means that potentially, because we don't sort of follow narrative threads for individuals, you could pick up somebody's experience in like 1938 and then never say what happens to them.
Yeah.
We thought there was a dereliction of responsibility there, kind of, museological, but also more importantly, really moral and ethical. So
And sometimes they have changed their names, so the viewer doesn't know it's the same person, is it?
yeah, because
The
we used
Yeah,
their names are always contemporaneous as well. So
yeah.
so like Anita Lasker at the start is just Anita Lasker because she's not Anita Lasker Wildfish yet, and all that and that sort of stuff.
Mm.
So we so this screen has that information, but we tried to be really, really careful about the fact that we were saying, first of all, it couldn't assume the status of a memorial, because the
Mm.
museum is not a memorial museum. It doesn't have a commemorative function. It's
Yeah,
not, the director general felt very strongly about that. And also, it couldn't suggest that we were offering kind of cohesive, holistic life narratives, because that's, I mean, that's just not with
yeah,
in whatever we were using, 75 words or something that can't even begin to touch the side.
yeah,
So we had to kind of find this sort of a mode of expression that acknowledged the fact that these were fragmentary pieces of information, and that they were related to what's happening in the galleries, and that they weren't commemorative. And we had loads of issues with it, just couldn't find the right way to do it. And then suddenly one day, Gary, the designer, said, hang on a second, like, what if we use the backing of archival paper at the back of this piece?
mm.
And I was like, yeah, because then the piece is, as much as anything else, about the means by which, or the process by which, archivization sort of structures the chaotic messiness of lived reality.
Yeah.
And so then the whole mantra of the piece became about that. And then we thought, well, hang on, that starts to solve the problem about how to use the testimony, because then, rather than it being testimony that just comes sort of arbitrarily at the end,
Mm.
the testimony, and it doesn't quite read in the space, but the underlying
Yeah.
philosophy is that the background of the screens on which the testimony appears is the same as the background on the large screen. To say the testimony is part of the archive. It isn't the sort of necessarily the dominant feature of the archive, or it doesn't exist at the top of the hierarchy of the archive. It's a part of the archive that sits alongside all of the rest of the archive, and the archive speaks to itself. Do you know
And
what I mean?
uncut.
Uncut,
Yeah.
because that's how it exists.
Yeah.
And it means that there is a sort of an affective dimension to that, because it means that when you sit down, and this is done throughout the galleries actually, by and large, the eye level of the interviewee is sort of at the same level as the
Get it.
person who's watching them.
Yeah, because
Um,
you sit to watch them.
Yes, and there's speakers
Yeah.
behind you in the seat. So until you sit down, you can hear like a babble of voices when you walk into the space. But when you sit down, the speakers are very directional. So it sort of directs the voices into your ear in a way that we were really pleased about. So we didn't want to have to get involved with sort of headphones and all that sort of
But
stuff.
James, can I ask you, those interviews, are they actually part of the official oral history collection, or they're just a sort of
So
a
they were
separate thing?
recorded specifically for the previous exhibition.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think there was an enormous amount of kind of forward thinking about what other uses that they might serve because they just had that very directional function.
Because I was just thinking, I have a feeling they are not, for example, now featured on the portal. So if they are somewhere, they could of course be featured on the portal if that's of
Yeah,
interest.
I'm not. I don't. I think their
Where do
status
they
was.
sit? Like, do they
I
sit?
don't. Well, because they were sort of done as a through a sort of like a
Production.
professional commercial production company. Yeah, I think there was. I think there's. I think there might be conditions as to their use, which is potentially why they
Okay,
haven't appeared here.
I see. Anyway, maybe that's for a future conversation. If from your part, I mean,
Yeah. No, it'd be. I mean, I think it'd be great for them to see. I mean, one of the interesting things that we ran into actually, and it speaks to one of the issues that we were talking about at the start, is that when we came to use them in this way, so the decision that we made is that we would use the interviews uncut. The only thing we did cut, and we did make a few slight trims, is there were moments where it felt like there was a very sort of private interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee, and we thought that would be an overstep on our part because
for
clearly that.
example, James, give us an
I,
example.
I th do you know, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but it would have been moments where you just thought this would have bothered the person being interviewed if they'd have ever thought that we would then make it public.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Not that
yeah.
they were sort of saying anything offensive or anything, but I think just sort of a moments we thought, yeah, it just you just thought this is not this is almost like eavesdropping in a way that's not right.
I
I'm
mean,
trying to
that's
think of
quite a
any
big
others.
decision to make, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
What belongs in that category? Because that's for me, as somebody who's done lots of testimony, that is a big question when making something completely public or putting it on the web, like in the portal. We have made now 60 interviews public.
Yeah,
It worries me that there is stuff which is private. Luckily, I think, with the camera, it makes it more clear that it is a public interview, more than with a cassette recorder where people really tell you things because they don't think it's public. But there's still things in there which I think, maybe that's not for public consumption. But
and it is, and I think I suppose what sort of really amplified our sensitivity to it is that the interviewees, when they did those initial interviews, the sort of the defined purpose was that they were going to be used for these quite sort of discreet
mm,
screens, and so
yeah,
that I sort of feel like if I'm interviewed to do something now, like we're doing at the moment,
yeah,
I sort of feel like I know the deal. I know what I'm getting myself in for,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
if I say anything I shouldn't say or frame it, then ultimately, that's all me. Whereas for these people, you think, well, they weren't the tenets under which they did that.
Well, this raises the whole thing about, informed consent, and this is something we're dealing with the portal, obviously, because by putting something out there, the assumption is that the person would approve of it,
Yeah.
because obviously somebody who was interviewed 10 years ago can't, and that it's in their interest, and that's an assumption to be made. I think most survivors who give testimonies, they would probably approve of it. And now, in fact, I'm asking everyone I'm interviewing, would you like to be in the portal? And everyone says yes. I have not come across one person who said not. So it's interesting. The consent is a big issue, for social media usage,
And
for
I think I sort of feel like it's quite reasonable to assume that if somebody, not even, is willing to be interviewed, but wants to be interviewed, that then on some level they want to be
yeah,
heard, and
yeah.
I think what when we were talking about the sort of the repurposing of the testimonies for the new galleries, we tried to be really upfront with the families. There weren't many of the original interviewees still around. There were a few, but we tried to be really, really open with the families, and had an event where we brought them in and said, look, this is what we're planning to do.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think I actually was there.
oh,
Yeah.
you may probably were one of those
Yeah.
things. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we didn't, it would have been awful to sort of just blindsided with them. And what I was trying to say at the time is that I know that on one hand, it might seem difficult because it feels like they'll be less conspicuous because they're not peppered throughout the exhibition. On the
Mm.
other, actually, we're using like everything they had to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? They're potentially they're more heard because they're heard on their own terms. And as you say, the idea was also that it wouldn't be interactive in any respects,
Mm.
in that situation, because it means that when visitors come into the space, they sit down, they take
Mm.
they have to, they're not the one in ownership of who's
Yeah.
speaking and when.
But interestingly, did you not use any of the recordings for the exhibition, the audio recordings?
Not the audio recordings, no, not
And
because,
what why was that?
well, I suppose just because it was just came down to a sort of space thing in the end that the only place that we could have used them would have been at the end because of contemporaneity.
Mm.
So then it would have been about like how do you do that in a space which is already trying to deal with quite a lot of things.
Hmm. And why were they not used in the first exhibition then? I
I suspect it's because of a sense that that's it's what we were saying before about where oral history sort of existed in the sort of
Yeah,
cultural space at the time that they didn't have the sort of status they did now, and there's a sense that in order for people to engage they need to see.
the video. So that at that time probably they thought that it has to be video rather than
Yeah,
audio.
and also I think because they were working well, yeah, I suppose because if you think about it in just really hot, sort of highly practical terms, if one of the reasons for using these things is to create something to build an exhibition around,
Mm.
then the visual element is an important part of the physical experience of the exhibition. And the reason that they did those interviews in the way that they did and didn't use the oral testimony ones as well, I think is because they they knew the sort of what you call, I suppose, in documentaries, like the narrative beats that they
Yeah.
were trying to hit. And so rather than trying to kind of sort of backfill from things that had already been pre-recorded, then they could sort of move forward going, right, this interview is going to try and, or this is the beat that we're trying to fill with this, so we can ask questions that directional to sort of serve that point. I mean, that said, it was more organic than that insofar as the end of the previous exhibition, which was the built around the interviews and people talking about how they now think about these things. I think that
Mm.
um, that wasn't planned. That just sort of came out organically through the
Yeah.
interview process, and they kind of
So,
you know
so in fact, the Imperial War Museum interviews are more used by other people than by the museum.
the
The
oral
those
testimony
audio.
ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, we use them, and I continue to use them actually quite a lot as part of our research. So particularly for families whose objects are on display, if there is also an oral testimony recording for those things, we would have questions about like, but why do they bring that and not that, or when did they get here, or what was, and so we
Okay.
go into the archive and research these things. So the team use them quite a lot, but certainly within the exhibition as it stands,
Yeah.
that's the case. That's not to say that will remain the case. I mean, I suspect within the galleries that will remain the case, but things will happen in other
Yeah.
IWM sites and
Yeah.
other IWM projects which will use them, I think.
So James, just to kind of wrap this up, so any personal highlights or something you have used from this collection, from the audio collections, which stands
I
out?
think
Or
it's things like that. It's do for me actually, on a this isn't really about kind of
no?
scholarly histories. It's more sort of a personal thing that I find that because of the moment in time that we're at, we we have objects and histories from individuals who passed some time ago,
Yeah.
and I encounter them through what's been written about them or the objects that they've donated,
Yeah.
etc. But I don't know what they sound like, and then and it's really, I mean, it is kind of lovely actually that sometimes you just click on something and you go, oh, that's her. And it doesn't that doesn't mean that I get to know them in any way, but it just sort of brings a different level of like humanness to them, particularly when it's like the one I'm thinking about at the moment is Ruth Locke, who came here on the Kinder Transport. Her name was there, Ruth Neumann. Her son Tim Locke has been very helpful, very involved.
Yeah.
There's an incredible archival collection which the family amassed, which they've donated to the museum
Yeah.
in a really kind of helpful way. And so I feel like through the time I spent with Tim, through the sort of the volume of the collection, there's a lot of I've had a lot of kind of exposure to Ruth Locke and her family,
Yeah.
but it was just then hearing her voice, and I was like, oh God, I was just, and I find things like that really,
Mm.
that I really value. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's interesting. So because you start in a way from the object and then you go back
yeah,
and linking that object to the person. That is, but I think it's right. It's the voice or, if you have video, the voice and the video or something, which is very powerful.
it
Yeah.
I was corresponding recently with a lady whose father's got some documents in the galleries who donated them a long time ago, and she's been, very lovely and helpful. And she sent me a video, a link to her father doing a presentation, talking to a group of students in Germany. And that's one that I've been around this guy's name and details and for a long time, it was weird. It was like it was kind of emotional in a way because you just thought, God, he just had like a real warmth about him, that thing sometimes you think it doesn't happen all the time. You think, God, he sounds like a really
Mm,
lovely man, and I only know him from like this little photo
yeah.
on a single document and this one account of who he was and what happened to him in the late
Yeah.
1930s. And I don't know, that I think is irreplicable, and that takes us to that point as well about why, like the minutiae of the timbre of the individual's voice
Yeah.
matters. And any act of revoicing it can never bring us
Yeah. Yeah.
close to that, I think.
Well, and the wonderful thing in this portal, hopefully it will be now accessible to a much broader audience in a way, and hopefully bring more people to Imperial War Museum site.
It's yeah, it's so valuable and so important. I mean, I think just making things accessible and easily accessible is the most crucial thing if you want people to engage with it.
Well, it will be interesting, as I said before, to find out how many people who've given testimony in Imperial War Museum are then have given later
To other
time
places, yeah,
and
true.
audio, and then you can compare the audio and the video element and see
Yeah,
what
that's
difference
true.
that made. Um,
Yeah.
okay, but a last question I have to you: Are you worried about anything in terms of the future for, I guess, testimony in terms of AI and other development? Are you worried about?
I mean, I suppose no more worried about testimony than I am about anything else related to sort of AI and deep fakes and all that sort of stuff. I think for me, yeah, no, I suppose it was tricky, because on one hand, in terms of convenience, it's like we were talking about at the start, the what AI will allow us to do in used in good faith and in sort of legitimate ways will be to sort of catalog
Yeah,
to the nth. And I suppose the concern with that in mind is that if testimony is just allowed to become like a resource that exists to determine very specific points of fact or
mm,
detail, we'll
mm,
lose that thing that happens when you just have to listen to somebody for 20 minutes to just we'll lose the spaces between. I suppose that like there is a risk there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You want the whole recording. I mean, it's interesting, whether you can. Obviously, you can't force the user to have a minimum amount of listening or,
Yeah,
yeah.
but it's a trade-off, isn't it? I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
It's funny because sometimes it's things like you'll know this, but sometimes the interview you will say, "Oh, you don't want to hear about that," or "There's nothing to say about that," and you think, "God, I mean, there definitely is," but it's interesting that you think there isn't. That those things like matter. You know,
Yeah, or
those.
somebody says, "Oh, my story isn't really interesting or isn't important."
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
How will that come up in an index? Or this, it definitely won't come up.
It won't.
Um,
One of the things that we found, even in terms of the way that when we were doing the subtitles for the testimonies in the galleries, is like a means of subtitling something which somehow does something to acknowledge the sort of messy fragmentariness of the way that people talk. Even subtitles somehow like
yeah,
clean it up.
yeah, that's interesting. By definition, yeah,
Yeah,
like, yeah, yeah, something exactly. Does it distract from the listening? Does the subtitle distract from listening?
yeah.
Lots to think about. But anyone, so anyone who is going to use the Imperial War Museum interviews on the portal, anything they should look out for? Anything you want to advise them or?
No, I would say that it does offer a reasonably comprehensive breadth and span of different experiences. I think, and which means that I mean, obviously nothing can ever offer sort of totally meaningful coverage, but there is it's relatively representative of the history, which there's a lot to be said for. And I do think it's interesting, and it's the point that you made that there is a sort of the oral testimonies particularly are an interesting counterpoint to the video ones.
Yeah.
I think the fact that there is no picture shouldn't lead us to think that somehow they lose something, like they gain something at the same time they lose something as well.
Well, and interestingly enough, there will be a picture now because they'll be can be cross-referenced
Oh yeah, sure.
with the other
Okay.
interviews. So suddenly all these audio interviews will have
We'll have some sort of yeah.
there will be another reference for some of them. So
Yeah,
for
yeah.
some of them. Anyway,
Yeah.
listen, I could discuss this much more. I could talk about testimonies, but just to say thank you so much, James. It was great
Thank
to talk
you.
to you. And I will stop the recording now. Hold on, how do I do that? Thank you so anything you would like to add, which I haven't asked you?
No, I don't think so. Um, I'm not quite across where we're at in terms of. I think we've got most of this stuff digitized, haven't we? But it's an ongoing
Yeah. I mean, it
effort.
says that there are 1,000 interviews, I think, available, but 40 are available on the portal. And
Okay.
obviously, if somebody is looking for more, they'll get in touch with you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, hopefully it will all be. We've got a big new digitization, and a big ongoing digitization project at the moment across the collection. So, unfortunately, it's just one of those things. With I never really sort of paused to think about it before working at the museum, but like they're just playing catch up all the time.
Yeah. So it's a big digitization going on. Yeah.
Yeah.